Welcome to the Supply Chain Tech Podcast with Rombi. In this episode, we speak with Sue Lee, the director of Hexagon Supply Chain, a consultancy dedicated to empowering all actors in the pharma logistics chain of custody with effective education, planning, and procedures. Sue shares some of the challenges the industry faces as it ramps up to distribute the COVID-19 vaccines in the new normal at an unprecedented scale and velocity. Sue, welcome to the Rombi Supply Chain Tech Podcast. Today, in context of everything that the world is seeing during the pandemic, there is a huge challenge for the pharmaceutical sector, which is to get across the COVID-19 vaccines that are largely in the clinical trial phases today out to the population at large. Now, this is not a challenge that has ever been of such a big magnitude simply because of the fact that most of the other vaccines till date have been to very targeted individuals. It could be either the elderly or it could be children. But for the first time, we are actually looking to vaccinate the world. And obviously, that is a huge challenge in terms of distributing this vaccine and getting it out to every patient who needs it and who needs it on time, Sue. So with your experience with the healthcare industry and as a GXP advisor, I have a few questions around this whole topic, but I would like to begin with a very simple question. Why is it so big of a challenge? Because you always had pharmaceutical companies who were shipping across the world. There were trade lanes. There is vaccines going out into every country. Why is this so unique in your opinion?
It's the sheer scale of what's going on. It's the sheer requirement to go into getting on for 200 countries across the world. And that's clearly going to end up being a rather staged approach. But what we don't want to do as an industry, I think, is to disenfranchise some of the less developed countries in the world, to concentrate on Western Europe, North America, which is where traditionally large amounts of clinical trials have gone on, and indeed where some of the COVID trials are going on at the moment, so that there's a lot of scope to be going out into some less developed areas which have their challenges in terms of setting up supply lanes, actually physically moving material, whether that ends up being sent on aircraft, whether it ends up being sent by ship. It will all have temperature control requirements, as all vaccines do. And at the moment, we don't know what any of those requirements are going to be. We don't know how it's going to end up, because there are so many vaccines on trial at the moment that they will probably be 2 or 3 that come out as being the ones which go into mass production. We don't know where they're going to be produced, although the Gates Foundation has put a huge amount of time and resources into supporting the industry in terms of getting vaccine trials up and running, and has committed to providing physical infrastructure to be able to manufacture vaccine. But we still don't know exactly where that's going to be, which is going to happen, and how we're going to be able to transport temperature control material at whatever temperature it turns out to be into some very challenging locations, which have not typically been used as part of clinical trials. They will clearly be getting some level of commercial drug supply chain into them, but it's probably going to be a very limited number when you start looking at very small places. If you are looking at islands, if you're going out into India, then there's huge challenges going up into the mountain areas, somewhere like going into the Himalayas, into Nepal. You know, these are places that we don't regularly send drug and vaccine to. And that's before you start getting into the more remote areas in South America, in Africa. All of these places do not traditionally take part in big clinical trials or in big commercial supply. And so we're going to have to relearn all of that in a situation that we're at now, where there are not so many commercial aircraft flying, and a lot of commercial aircraft that are passenger aircraft have been repositioned into being cargo aircraft. So there are too many unanswered questions at the moment for us to be really clear to be able to say, well, we're going to do it like this. And that's only going to evolve over probably the next year or so.
So in that context, all of these large challenges you're talking about, is any of them actually visible in the clinical trials phase? Because a lot of companies are actually already shipping out vaccines to conduct these clinical trials.
Well, a lot of the clinical trials, you have to remember, there are global clinical trials going on, but a huge amount of what's being done is still being happening the traditional places in North America, Western Europe, a bit into Eastern Europe. And so a lot of clinical trial is concentrated on there at the moment because it's a relatively straightforward population and market to be able to serve in terms of supply chain, but also in terms of having well-educated and well-motivated investigators, having infrastructure put in place in order for clinical trials to take place, having full GXP in place, using things like the European Clinical Trials Directive in order to conduct trials, which gives a regulatory framework for that to happen. And everywhere in the world is going to need to be serviced ultimately, and that may include places which have not taken part in the clinical trials at all. And so the infrastructure won't have been set up in order for that material to go in straight away. So that infrastructure is going to have to be built. The supply chain routes are going to have to be investigated to work out things like replenishment, whether it turns out that we end up with a vaccine that's moving on liquid nitrogen, or we end up with one which is on dry ice or on 2 to 8. If you're going to go into a small airport somewhere and have to wait for customs to clear it, who are not used to clearing drug supplies, they're not used to the pharma chain and all the requirements around it, there aren't going to be fridges and freezers set up in place for you to be storing boxes whilst you wait for the customs process to go through necessarily. And what we do end up with is a situation where we're more likely to have temperature excursions because of well-meaning people putting boxes into fridges and freezers while they wait for the whole paperwork process to go through. And I think one of the things that supply chain has to get on board with is being really well prepared and dealing with and talking to people who know what they're doing about going into remote locations, who've had experience of doing that, in order to be able to set up paperwork in advance, to have everything possible pre-arranged to reduce the clearance time and to retain control of what's going on with shipments as they're moving. And that's going to be a really key component of how we make sure that vaccines get in so that they can still be used. So there's no temperature excursion, there's no issues around how they've been controlled.
So Sue, I think you're touching upon a lot of things that actually could go wrong in the supply chain or the chain of custody, right? From the time that it's manufactured to the time that it
is the nature of having worked in quality and risk management for a number of years, is that I am always looking for what are going to be the problems and how are we going to try and control those.
Absolutely. And in that context, you are actually a GXP expert and an advisor. So what is GXP? What are these good distribution practices about? Could you kind of walk us through what needs to be followed at every step in the chain of the time that it's manufactured till the point that it actually reaches the patient?
So there are a lot of components to GXP. It includes good distribution practice, really crucially, but it also requires us to consider good data practice, good storage practice, good clinical practice. There's a whole lot of regulations that all come together. And one of the key parts of being able to physically get things to move in a compliant way is to be clear about what applies at each step of the transport, whether it's as it's being stored, choosing what kind of boxes it's going to go into, temperature monitoring along the way, also around making sure that temperature data is moved in a regulatory compliant fashion. And so all of these things, storage and premises, how you temperature map fridges that you're going to precondition gel packs and things like that in, there's hundreds of different factors which all need to be applied. The correct ones need to be applied to actually physically moving a box from point A to point B. What's happened in the manufacturing process will make a huge difference about how the shipment is going to move, but it's not necessarily the thing that you are looking at and considering when you're picking up a package and taking it and delivering it. So you need to be clear about which parts of the regulations apply when a shipment's actually physically in transit, but also at the point it's being dispatched, at the point it's being unpacked, when it gets to the pharmacy. What we want to be really clear about is that shipments move in such a way they are expedited through customs clearance where it's possible to do so, so that you don't have them sitting around with the potential for a temperature excursion. But also, it's really critical that we have things like the pharmacist who's going to receive it at the hospital actually knows it's coming and allocates space for it in the fridge or the freezer when it's there. And that can be a really, really challenging thing. I've heard pharmacists describe Tuesdays as being like Christmas, that they're going to come in, there'll be lots of packages, and they've got no idea what's in any of them, because a whole lot of material has just been sent out by drug companies and arrived with them. And so making sure that they know what's going on, that the site location has an idea. But also, if you're going to be sending a shipment that's going through and is being delivered direct to patient, because that then brings in a whole raft of extra requirements around data control, about being clear about who knows who the patient is under the circumstances where you're making delivery. And one of the things that COVID has brought about is a really big change in the way that we look at making deliveries in. So before, there were a very small number of companies who were just beginning to try out doing direct-to-patient deliveries. Now, because of the additional requirements of being able to just get drug into patients so that they can use it, there's a whole raft of people who have now decided that they are going to use direct-to-patient as a methodology for getting shipments through. And that could be that it's being transferred from the site, so it could be pick up from the site that goes straight into the patient. But then you open up a whole new set of complications around who knows who the patient is, how the delivery is going to take place, how do you make sure the patient's there in order to take their delivery. You can't have them sign for things because that could be an issue around patient confidentiality. You can't have their relatives sign for things because they might have the same surname. That could be a data breach. Also, you don't want to leave patients who potentially are very ill with a huge thermally controlled box that you just sit outside their door, step back 2 meters, ring the doorbell, and go, there are your drugs. Because that's unfair to patients to give them that additional burden of being able to take the materials in, and then they've got all of this temperature control material that presumably they've got to do something with. Temperature monitors as well, so all of that. So there's a complexity that's been added in addition to all the complexity of physically getting things to move on an aircraft, which is a challenge in and of itself to certain routes these days because of the restriction in the number of passengers that are traveling.
Yeah, so what is compounding the problem is really that it's not just the unprecedented scale of things, but also the fact that, the carrier capacity and all of that is actually low because of the pandemic. So the pandemic actually impacted your normal supply chain. So you're actually working with a limited supply chain today. And in addition to that, you are now looking to distribute an enormous amount of vaccines and
billions of doses.
Exactly. And in that context, Sue, you talked about customs, you talked about the last mile delivery. I'm just curious as to how many touch points or change of hands exist in a typical vaccine supply chain. Is it like 5, 6, 10, 15?
Potentially hundreds, quite literally hundreds, because of the number of people that it will go through from the point where you have it collected from the manufacturer. In the process of being manufactured, it's going to go through potentially dozens of different places, different points where additional parts of the manufacturing process take place. Once it actually gets collected, so you'll have a driver who comes to take it, it'll go to a depot, it'll then go across to an airport, it's going to go through potentially dozens of hands moving across the airport, people physically driving it, people interacting with the paperwork to go with it. Then it will physically travel on the aircraft, get to the other end, then it can go through dozens of different hands as it goes through individual airports until the point where it gets handed to a driver and then gets taken to actually make delivery at the consignee. Now, there are ways to cut down that. So if you go with an airport that's gone through the IATA pharmaceutical certification process, then they will potentially have a specific pharma control area where material is taken and stored, and they have very stringent requirements about how they move material inside the airport and how many people actually take physical control of it or documentary control of it. And that can make a massive difference. IATA have worked incredibly hard with airlines and with individual airports to try and make these kind of havens of pharmaceutical moves. And they're definitely, their increased compliance makes a huge difference, particularly if you're going out to somewhere in the less developed world and choosing the airports that you're going to go through along the way. So somewhere like Brussels, for example, has worked really hard on being a fully certificated airport, and also has a lot of flights going out into places like Africa, so that you can use that as a transfer point, and you're much more likely to get a successful shipment taking place because of the certification work that's been done. So that can make a massive difference to how you're moving things.
Interesting. So when you're talking about all of these certified airports and the care that a vaccine needs to go through, is it largely from the temperature perspective, or are there more factors to consider in the chain of custody?
That's a good question. Temperature is absolutely critical. It absolutely is going to be the thing that is most likely to cause a problem with actually making a successful delivery, and part of that is because it's one of the things that's very straightforward to monitor, and so therefore you use one of the available commercial temperature monitors. There are lots of different options to do that, but it means that you can see when it gets into the site location. You take the temperature monitor out of the box, and it's really simple for you to be able to go, it's got an alarm on it, or it hasn't. It's got a cross or it's got a tick. Whereas some of the other things people are not monitoring for. So some of the things which might affect the efficacy of a vaccine aren't always a standard monitoring option. So people don't generally check for humidity, vibration, light, sensitivity, all those kind of things, because they're much more challenging to be able to monitor. Humidity is probably the least difficult of them. You can buy monitors that also have humidity sensors. If you want to start doing vibration, or whether it's in a dry shipper, if it's been tilted, things like that, there are less options for being able to easily see that information when you get to a site location. So people don't generally monitor for them, whereas there's still things that can affect the efficacy of the vaccine when it gets there.
That's interesting. So how are companies preparing for this challenge? Because with hundreds of touch points in the chain of custody, and you relying on people in the chain of custody to actually tell you whether the vaccine arrived in the right condition or not, it's a Herculean task. So how do you see companies are approaching this problem, especially at the scale that you're talking about, and shipping to regions that they are not familiar with, like the less developed worlds, parts of Asia and parts of Africa and South America?
I think actually good companies don't, other than the increase in scale, are already perfectly well prepared for this, because it's been a requirement for all of the drug supplies that have been being moved for such a long time, that people have developed really sophisticated supply chain processes in order to be really clear about the people that they're using in order to ship material, which airlines things are going in, which airports they're going through, how is the packaging going to work, what temperature monitoring options are going to be used. All of those things people have got it set up at a really well-managed level. And a huge amount of work has been done by the big pharmaceutical companies, who are the people who are really working on vaccines, to be able to say that they have very good supplier agreements in place. They are monitoring everything that's going on with shipments that they're moving. So if you are looking at a particular box supply, they will know where it is and who's got their hands on it at most of the time. Certainly at all the major touch points, they will know where it is. Lots of people are using things like GPS tracking now, so that you can see where a shipment is at a particular time as it's moving through. And the options doing that have massively evolved, come down in price a lot, and so that's being used a lot of the time. And I think certainly for the initial COVID vaccine supplies, those are going to be such high profile things that people will be putting all their time and energy, as you would want for every shipment, to make sure that there are no possibilities of things going wrong, or that those possibilities are reduced absolutely as far as possible, because this is going to make all the difference as to how everybody in the world, all of our lives, evolve over the next few years.
So, in your experience and looking at this challenge of vaccine distribution today, how long do you think it is actually going to take for us to vaccinate the whole world?
That's a really, really big question, isn't it? And one that we really want to know. It's interesting when you talk to people, because everybody now has read so much across the news, so everybody is so well educated, or hopes that they're so well educated on what's going on and how it's going to be. Everybody's got massive opinions on how all of this should be. And the problem is that we have no concrete answers at this stage. We don't know when we're going to get a vaccine. We don't know how it's going to do what it's going to do. We don't know how it's going to be transported, where it's going to be going, all of those things. So I was training some people who are working on a vaccine last week, who were saying that, you know, it's going to be, well, into next year. There's no possibility of having anything until at least partway through next year. And at that point, we've got to hit the ground running. I know that there are lots of people who are already planning now for how they're going to be shipping things. Even not knowing how they're going to be shipping things, they're looking at all of the potential options, trying to see what kind of materials they're going to use to keep things at the right temperature, to see how they're going to box them, how they're going to monitor them, all of that stuff we've already talked about. And so being ahead of the game at the point in which vaccines are actually released, then they will be able to basically hit the ground running. They will have some level of supplies in order to be able to get the first shipments out straight away. And that's going to be really crucial for us to make sure that that's going to work in an international context, that we can actually physically move things in place. But it's going to get to some of these more remote locations, it's going to take a while. So my finger in the air is going to be about 18 months to 2 years before we've got everybody vaccinated, which fits in with previous issues with epidemics and pandemics. If you look at the Spanish flu of 1918, that was about 2 years before things began to get settled down. So I'm expecting we're going to be operating on the same kind of timescale. But the drive is there, the push is there, also the money is there, because pharma have money to be able to spend on making this thing happen. And they've got support of people like the Gates Foundation, the WHO, all of these international agencies that are going to be really making sure that the vaccine is not confined into Western Europe and North America, that it goes out and it goes out across the world so that everybody gets the advantage of having it when we get to a point where we've got a vaccine which works.
And thankfully, I think we live in a world today which has a lot more technology horsepower, a lot of a global perspective, and hopefully we should be able to get this vaccine out to the larger population much more quicker. I have a question.
I really hope so. I really hope so, because, you know, I love my family, but really I want to get out, as everybody else does, into the same world. I want to go and enjoy life as we had it before. Whereas now we're just pretty much confined. So we're all in the same boat. Everybody's pushing in the same direction at this stage.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Sue, if you were to tell me, with your experience, the trainings and workshops that you had with the vaccine manufacturing companies, what are the 3 tips that they need to most definitely consider at this point while they are planning for the big distribution?
I think the crucial one is going to be making sure that they've got huge flexibility in how they're going to make everything happen. So talking to lots of different transport suppliers, lots of different routing options. Don't rule out sending things via different transport modes. So a lot of the time, people's automatic belief when they are shipping is going to be that it's going to go on a flight. But that isn't always necessarily the best way to do things. There's a lot of really good options at the moment on sending sea freight, and a lot of work has been done in order to make sure that we can maintain temperature if things are being shipped by sea. And it will take longer, clearly, to send something by sea. But I think everybody is going to be pushing together in order to make sure that these vaccine deliveries happen. And so exploring how the sea freight companies are going to be able to move things in temperature controlled reefers and things like that is going to be really useful in order to try and get to some of the more challenging places. So temperature is really crucial and critical. Being really clear about the documentation that's going to be required. So that is a really good planning point that can be done now, regardless of where we're going to. Building up a database of what we're going to need in terms of import licenses, import permits, what kind of certification is going to be required, how many temperature monitors to put in boxes, all of those kind of things is all stuff that can be prepared for now in advance. And also being really clear about using things like depots in order to be able to get vaccine in, to be looking at depots now who can handle multiple levels of temperature control, to be able to give a really flexible regime of getting supplies out at the right time. So if we can get stuff into depots and then start distributing out from there, then using depots can be a really good way of controlling the flow of materials in and out and being very flexible in terms of getting things into the ultimate location. If you've got stuff in a country and you've already done all of the customs clearance and all of those things, then being able to do domestic moves in order to make the last bit of it happen is a lot simpler than trying to do an entire move. So using depots is going to be a really important strategy for people moving things around.
So what essentially you are proposing is that it's time now for the companies to think how they are going to get control over the end-to-end supply chain rather than just the last mile or pieces of it. So that if that is in place, then you are better off with knowing which lanes you're going to use. You will be able to assess your new transport partners better and all of that stuff.
Also having all of those options talked about, set up, risk managed. So risk assessments across the board for everything. So that we can be prepared for, because the world has changed so much and the world is changing and evolving continuously at the moment. So the things that we think are the way that the world works may not be the way the world works in 6 months' time or a year's time when we start really moving things, because we don't know how flights are going to be operating. We don't know. We could be almost back to normal, or we could be in a much worse situation than we are now, and nobody knows. And that's all going to be dependent on how the virus evolves, if it shifts. We don't want to be in a place where we have no people to be able to physically move things about. And that is a very significant possibility. So we've got to be flexible and adaptable and agile, all of those words that you read on logistics supply chains. This is how, we should be doing everything. They all apply in this case. We've got to be able to plan ahead so that we can do whatever needs to be done depending on what conditions are at that point. And none of us know what they're going to be, which is the real crucial challenge.
And what would be your tips to the logistics service providers who are gearing up for this challenge?
Talk to lots and lots of people, because everybody's got an opinion on what's going on. But we need to take all of those into account, and we need to be able to flex. As logistics service providers, need to be able to flex to what pharma needs them to do in order to make this happen. But the same, it applies the other way as well. So pharma have got to be able to flex to what's available and what ultimately the supply chains that are in operation, the methodology that we're going to have. We may turn to doing everything electronically. We may end up going back to using physical paper. Because we're going into all of these kind of places, and we will be going into these places where they are not used to having pharma shipments. It may be they're not geared up for having electronic transfer of data, things like that. That's another very good thought, is looking for importers of record now that you're going to be able to get your materials in. because some of those are going to take a long time to put in place. And so being clear about who's going to take responsibility for tax, for documentation, for record keeping in whatever countries you're going to be going into, because some of these will be uncharted and are going to be challenging to make that be set up. So if we start on that now, if that hasn't started already, then that's going to be a really crucial and critical point to be able to not have to start that process when shipments are moving, but to be prepared for shipments to move in advance. I think preparation is absolutely the most significant and important thing that we can be doing.
Great, Sue. So if I was to summarize everything that you talked about in this podcast, the first thing is that the enormity of this challenge, especially because we are shipping vaccines to many parts of the world which have never been the traditional large consumers of vaccines. So you are actually now working with unknown regions, you're working with new lanes, you're working with new transport modes to these lanes, which actually make this a challenge at an unprecedented scale.
I think just to add to that they're not used to doing lots of farm shipments. These are places where things will be moving in and out, but they may be things which have no temperature control, that they have no specific time constraints on them. And so that's going to bring about a much added complexity, which may not be prepared for. If you're going into a small island somewhere, they've probably never had to deal with the temperature control farmer supply in the past.
Absolutely. So with that in context, because you don't have that kind of first world infrastructure at all the places that you would be shipping to, which really means that the second point that you said to us in this podcast was plan really well, map out the routes, map out the way to get your vaccine there, but also the people involved in the chain of custody and their roles. And last but not the least was, I think, your point to all the supply chain professionals is expect the unexpected, be prepared for it, and ensure that you are able to visualize everything that you have from the point you dispatch your vaccine till it reaches your final patient in terms of temperature records, in terms of your maybe even your shipment location, and last but not the least is all your regulatory paperwork.
Absolutely. There's one more thing that I want to add to that, which is there has never been a better time for us to have people who are physically doing the job understanding why they are doing the job, because almost everybody will have known somebody, everybody's lives have been impacted by COVID. And so making sure that people understand the real value and the importance of their part of what's going on will empower them to do the job in such a way that we get really good compliance, we get really good shipments going ahead, that people care about what they're doing. And by giving people the opportunity to make a difference and for all of their actions to really do something very important, you're giving them much more of a reason to do their jobs well and to understand why that's so critical. And we get a better world out of that. And you can't, I defy anybody to come up with a better reason to do what they're doing for.
I think that's a wonderful point, Sue, because, the awareness, educating everybody in the chain of custody is not just going to help us to address this challenge, but it's also going to help us upskill the people who are involved in the entire pharmaceutical cold chain, so that in the future, we are better geared to face and better navigate these kind of challenges.
Exactly.
So much. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I think we learned a lot of insights today, a lot of which needs to be applied very quickly to this challenge that we have. I hope so. To this huge challenge that we have in front of us.
The vaccine comes soon. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, my name is Scott Mears and I'm one of the hosts of the Supply Chain Tech podcast with Roamby. On this podcast, we talk to supply chain heroes from around the world about everything, ranging from the disruptions related to supply chains, their personal experiences with tracking technologies, strategies to build resilience, and much, much more. We already have some recommended videos for you to the side of me, and if any of this sounds interesting to you, do subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss another Roby video. I'll see you next time.